I moved back to the United States this year after spending a year and a half in Europe, traveling to places like the UK, Portugal, Spain, and the Netherlands. And after being back now for the last 6 months, I've been reflecting a lot about how that time in Europe changed me, not just when it comes to the initial reverse culture shock that you feel when you come back from living abroad, but also how it's affected me long term and changed my daily life. The first thing I noticed when I returned to the US, and this is a bit of a reverse culture shock, is just the very palpable change in ambiance that you feel when you arrive to the airport. Now, I've been to a lot of major airports around the world: London, Paris, Amsterdam, Singapore, Sydney, Australia, but there's something about coming back to the US that just feels a little bit different. I think the first experience is when you get off the plane and you go through customs and immigration, and this is the first line of defense at the US border, and I understand that the men and women that work there are taking their jobs very seriously, but ever since I was a teenager and I traveled abroad for the first time, I always felt like I was doing something wrong when I got back to the US and was, just being interrogated about why I left in the first place. So it's kind of weird to get all of these questions about, why did you go on vacation? What did you do there? Who are you with? What did you bring back? And again, I understand that these people are just doing their jobs, but I've never felt that same way when traveling to other countries as I do when I return to my home country. And then this sentiment kind of continues as you go out into the airport terminal. You instantly get this flash of hustle culture and the rat race that kind of permeates from the cities and towns in the US into the airport. And everyone's just rushing around, super stressed out. And again, at big airports that I've been to in the rest of the world, they're also crowded, there are also a lot of people, but the feeling in the airport and the energy in the airport is always a lot calmer than when I'm going through New York or Atlanta or LA. And so I don't know what it is exactly, but it's like when you get back to the US, it's like this welcome home experience of a bit of resistance when you first walk in the door, and then you're just kind of overwhelmed, swept away by all of the frantic energy that you feel in the airport terminal. The next big difference is when you actually leave the airport and you need to get home or to wherever your next destination is. And in Europe, no matter where you fly into, you have this plethora of transportation options. You can take the bus, the train, the tram, the metro. But in the US, unless you're in a few really specific cities like New York, you pretty much have to take a car or an Uber or maybe a bus if you're lucky to get to your destination. And this really is just a foreshadowing of the lifestyle in the US, which involves having a car. And after having spent so many years of my life traveling and in Europe, I've decided that I really don't want a car right now. I don't want the cost and the responsibility and really the burden of owning a vehicle and paying insurance, but you can kind of feel like a bit of an outcast if you live in the US and don't have a car. But I have a lot of friends in Europe that have never even had a driver's license, and it's completely normal there. So definitely adjusting to the lack of public transportation in the US is a big challenge, especially when you really get used to the public transit in Europe and you get really spoiled by being able to just go to the train station or go to a metro or tram stop, and you can really end up going anywhere in Europe without even planning ahead. I was just in Belgium a couple weeks ago, and the trains are running to major cities on a 10 to 20 minute basis, whereas in the US, if you want to go across the country, you really need to fly. There's a lot that I do like about the US, especially the nature and all of the different climates that we have, whether you're on the West Coast or in the Midwest or in the South or the Northeast. And so that's something I appreciate about the US, especially being here in Miami with tropical surroundings. I can see the beautiful bay view out my window and palm trees. But something that I haven't completely readjusted to is the lack of, the ambiance from the architecture and the old buildings that are in Europe that I love as well. When I look around here, you see a lot of glass buildings, a lot of modern high-rises, skyscrapers, condos, and then suburbia surrounding the big cities in the US. And so I think you lose a little bit of the character and the history of the thousands of years that people have been settling in Europe. And then being in the US, it's really just a lot of, strip malls and shopping centers and kind of more new modern construction and commercial centers. And so that's something that definitely takes some adjustment. And I think this also really has a huge impact on the society and culture of the US, because the way everything is very spread out contributes to the lack of public transportation options, the high cost of getting places if you're driving or flying, and also the way that people interact together in society. Because in Europe, everything is a lot more condensed. Living areas are smaller, apartments and houses are smaller, and also the distances are shorter. So you get a lot of people that are able to walk places. You have a lot of people hanging out in town squares and city centers and parks. But in the US, because of the way our country has been developed, and there's a lot of different reasons for this behind the scenes, there's a lack of these, I think what they're called is third spaces, or public spaces where people just naturally congregate, where the way that the land and the zoning is developed is in a way to encourage interaction between people and between neighbors. Now, of course, you can go out to bars and restaurants, and there are parks in a lot of places, but you don't get that sense of routine where, okay, everyone's going here at this time, or everyone's hanging out around here at that time. It's more about commuting to work, maybe going out to eat on the weekends, like maybe going to the beach, maybe going to the park, but everyone is just like much more spread out. And I can't really think offhand of any places where all of my friends or people that I know like go to hang out every day, meet at a certain coffee shop and things like that. And we can't talk about the differences between living in Europe without taking a look at the cost of living. When I was younger, I always thought of Europe as being such an expensive place just because I had to buy a plane ticket to go there. But once you're actually staying in Europe long term, your cost of living can be a lot more moderate compared to a lot of places in the US. Now, it's no secret that there's inflation and a cost of living crisis in many parts around the globe, but the prices in the US now have just gotten insane. I mean, it's now costing $19 or $20 for an acai bowl in Miami. I mean, that's basically a smoothie with almond milk and some fruit on top. I mean, going out to the movies is expensive. Buying drinks at a bar or restaurant is really expensive. Gas is expensive. Like, everything has just gotten so expensive that it's gotten to a point where I don't even know how a lot of people survive in the US. I mean, talking to some of my clients on the phone, my relocation clients, one of them was telling me the other day that they pay $3,000 a month for health insurance. And that's like a whole nother topic that we can cover in a minute. But I mean, just general like rent, utilities, groceries. It's like as soon as I get back to the US, my cost of living triples or quadruples compared to almost anywhere else I live in the world. Like, my grocery bill is always 3 or 4 times higher in the US than it is in pretty much any country in Europe. And that's for really getting lesser quality food. I've talked about this in other videos because I don't know, I just feel like food is such an important part of any culture, and it's so important to your health. And so if the quality of the food system is compromised, then it really has this ongoing impact in other areas of your life. And you spend 3 or 4 times more for this food at the grocery store, but it doesn't taste as good, or it's not as fresh, or it goes rotten faster. And it's just something that I'll never get used to. As I mentioned, I was just in Belgium, and my significant other was making fun of me because I wouldn't stop talking about how good the tomatoes were. I mean, I was eating cherry tomatoes for breakfast because they just tasted like candy to me. And he's like, do they not have good tomatoes in the US? No. I mean, maybe in some places, but not in Florida. And that's just one example, of course, but it's also going out to eat. I've noticed that a lot of food tastes really similar in different restaurants. Now, a lot of restaurants have similar menus, but a lot of restaurants also use the same ingredients. So I did some research on this and I found out that there's really two major food distributors in the US, Sysco and US Foods. And depending on the source, I don't know the exact numbers, but they could make up around 20, maybe 30% of the food distribution of the US. So I think that explains part of why, you could get the same dish in all different restaurants and they might all taste really similar. It's like the more oil and salt you add to the food here, the better it tastes because it lacks just like that natural flavor that you get from produce, especially from fruits and vegetables. But then when you look at the food system in Europe, of course, it's not perfect. But from the research I did, there's anywhere from 450,000 to 1.5 million different suppliers and distributors. So this shows that maybe there's a lot more smaller companies that are working in the food distribution industry. And of course, instead of having different states around the US, we have different countries in Europe. So you're getting a lot of different providers, a lot of different cultures, and a lot of different countries coming together to provide food to the entire continent and of course around the world as well. But in the US, the numbers I saw here were anywhere from like 17,000 to 400,000 in a much bigger geographical area. So I think that's why you get, one of the reasons why you get more diversity in places like Europe. You're gonna have some of the same seeds and some of the same produce in different countries because of the EU, but you're also going to get, some differences in soil and quality and the way that these crops are being cultivated. Along with the subpar food supply in the US, and I know politicians will be the first to tell you that we have the best food system in the world and the best medical system in the world, et cetera, but something I've noticed more so now than before the pandemic is the increased convenience of everything. Of course, the US is synonymous with getting things fast and in a convenient way, but I've noticed a lot more delivery, a lot more to-go packaging, just a lot more waste in general. But unfortunately, I've also noticed the same trend in Europe. There's a lot more apps and websites where you can order food, but it's not as ubiquitous as it is in the US. And it seems like it's become just a normal part of everyday life. And I'm now finding myself feeling guilty whenever I order stuff takeout or get it delivered by Uber Eats, when I'm just like looking at the sheer amount of plastic and packaging that I use to eat one meal. I don't really hear people talking about that at all in the US. It just kind of seems like it's culturally accepted now, and it's also a necessity to be able to keep up with the fast pace of life here. That's another shift that I feel almost immediately when I come back to the US is a palpable difference in my work-life balance compared to if I'm living in Europe. Now, part of this is because as humans, we are creatures of habit. So when you re-enter a certain environment, whether it's a house or a workplace, we have certain triggers and cues for different habits. And so I feel like on a macro scale, when I come back to the US, it's almost like I engage in this rat race hustle culture gear that I used to have when I was growing up and going to school here, going to university and grad school. So even though I left the US while I was in college and then was living abroad for 15 years before I came back, it's like every time I would come back for vacation or to visit family or now coming back to live here for a few months, it's like I automatically go into more of a work mode compared to when I'm in Europe. So part of it is just habit and your personal habits and what you associate with work. Like when you walk into your office or sit down at your computer, you go into work mode. But the other part of it is that living in Europe, you really are a product of your environment. And when you're in a country or on a continent where the pace of life is just different and you are consciously and subconsciously observing the behavior of the people around you, that definitely has an effect on your own behavior. So during times that I was in the UK and I was working on the weekends, the people that I was friends with there would be having fun, like going to barbecues, going to a museum, taking the train to London, going for a hike. And so I would catch myself like, I'm going into work mode, and it would cause me to slow down. And it's the same when you see people, lounging around, enjoying the weather, sitting in a park in Amsterdam, or riding their bikes, or enjoying a glass of wine and people watching in Barcelona, or really anywhere in Europe. And because I don't get so many cues of other people relaxing and enjoying their lives in the US, I feel like that also causes me to work more, as well as when I try to spend time with my friends here. It seems like everyone is so busy, myself included, that none of us have time for anything or anyone else. It's like all people can do is just do what they have to do that day and then come home, watch Netflix, and just like collapse into bed after that. And this is another thing that I talked with a relocation client about on the phone. Is I was asking her what she was looking forward to when her and her family moved to Europe. And there was this long pause. And she said, I don't know. Like, she couldn't think of any hobbies or things that she wanted to do. She was like, we don't have time to have time here in the US. And she was living in the Pacific Northwest. She said, all we can do is work and take care of the kids, and just like, it's all we can do to keep it together. We don't have time to like think and daydream about other things that we wish we were doing, or what we can do when we have more time. And so I think that it just really epitomizes the feeling that a lot of people have in the US. And it wasn't just, her living in Washington State. It's people living in Texas and living in Maryland and living everywhere. I mean, one of my clients who lives in Texas, she told me she's been working since she was 8 years old, and she's just ready to move to France and enjoy her life. Like, she doesn't care what she does. She just wants to get out of the rat race and retire abroad and just have fun. And so I find myself thinking like, how can I have that lifestyle here? Like, is it possible to feel like that here, and to feel at peace, and to feel like you're not rushed? And, try to be more conscious of that, even when I'm not living in Europe or in other places where people have a high quality of life, in Latin America and Southeast Asia, where things are definitely a lot slower. While traveling the world can certainly inspire you with new ideas, you don't have to leave home to be able to grow and learn something new. I wouldn't be who I am or where I am today without investing in myself and learning new skills on platforms like Skillshare, the sponsor of this video. Skillshare is the largest online learning community for creative and curious people, offering thousands of classes for every interest imaginable. Whether you're looking to brush up on your skills for a new side hustle, explore creative hobbies, or focus on your personal growth, Skillshare makes learning accessible and fun. One of the features I love about Skillshare is their curated learning paths, which guide you step by step to mastering a new skill. Whether you're looking to learn photography, freelancing, or even a specific software like Adobe Photoshop, Skillshare has thousands of on-demand classes so you can fit learning into your schedule no matter how busy life gets. I've used Skillshare to learn many of the skills I use on a daily basis, from writing to photography to making these YouTube videos. And now you can try it too with this exclusive offer. If you use the link below this video and you're one of the first 500 people to sign up, you can get your first month of Skillshare absolutely free. Click the link below or scan this QR code right here and start discovering what's next for you. After 6 months of being back in the United States, I started feeling a bit lonely all of the time. Now, loneliness has become an epidemic, not just in the US, but around the world because of technology and because we spend so much time behind our screens. But there's also something a bit different where, even though I grew up in the US, I have a lot of friends here and have a lot of very close friends here, I still feel like I have better relationships with my friends who I've met in Europe. Part of this is because I left the US when I was so young, and so I wasn't able to cultivate those friendships and relationships here in the US because I was living in different countries. But another part of it, I can't really put my finger on it, is just different. Like, I find myself, if I need help with something, going to friends that are in different countries and talking with them more on WhatsApp and FaceTime. And I feel like I'm more likely to get a happy birthday message from friends in other countries than friends that I have here right down the street. And I do have a lot of really close friends that are in all different cities around the US, but they're married, they have kids, they have jobs, and they're really busy too. And so this is kind of like all these different factors coming together that make it why living in the US right now can be such a challenge. Whereas in Europe, because they have better work-life balance, they have better social services, people can take more time off and more vacations, and culturally they have more of a distinction between working life and personal life. I feel like all of that contributes to just making it easier to make friends and sustain friendships over there. Also, in the US, it's no secret that everyone is very preoccupied with the political situation here and very caught up in the mainstream news cycle. And it's been always like this in a way. I mean, 24-hour news was invented here in the US by Ted Turner at CNN. So this is just part of the US culture over the past few decades, certainly over the course of my entire life. But I heard a comedian say something recently, and I'll quote her specifically. She said, "We spend more time listening to podcasts than we do talking to each other." And I have noticed in the US that there's definitely a podcast culture where a lot of people spend hours a day consuming content by other people and listening to, the biggest podcasts in the country instead of talking to friends and neighbors. And so sometimes I'll go, months without talking to a friend or a while without talking to a family member. And the next time we talk, it's like, I feel like I'm having conversations with talking points from the news, talking points from this viral podcast. And it's just a really weird feeling. Like, I feel like the nature of my conversations have changed in the US versus some of my friends in Europe. They don't even listen to podcasts. They just, I don't know what kind of content they're consuming, but it seems like the news and podcasts and viral YouTube videos drive a lot of the conversation in the United States. And I just wish we had more variation in these topics and more of a culture of people having differing opinions and thinking more for ourselves rather than just reflecting on other people's opinions and their talking points. Now, I touched on the healthcare system a little bit, but coming back to US healthcare is always an adjustment. I haven't had any major health problems since I've gotten back. I've done my annual checkups, and luckily those have been covered by insurance. My prescriptions have been covered by insurance. I've also been having a lot of pain, like shoulder pain, neck pain, back pain, I think from sitting a lot at my desk. So I've been going to physical therapy for months to try to fix that, and that has been covered by my insurance as well. But it's definitely a general feeling of unease about what could happen here. And I know that my monthly insurance cost being at maybe $350 per month is a lot less than the $3,000 per month that families might have to pay. And I know it's just gonna get worse as I get older as far as the cost of care, the quality of care here. And so I think a lot of people who live in Europe, they don't worry so much about healthcare. I mean, maybe they have to wait for some services, but everything is free, or they have cheaper insurance plans, or it's covered by their taxes or the Social Security system. And so that's something that always is in the back of my mind while I'm here, and is always a topic that a lot of people are talking about. So it just can't be ignored here. Something else that can't be ignored in the US is the safety and security. And there's a lot of different things we could talk about here, but I want to hone in directly on gun violence because this is one factor that distinguishes the US from a lot of other countries. And I don't want to get political about it. I just want to say that it's so common and so ubiquitous in the US that I really fear every time I come back here that people are getting more and more desensitized to it. But when you know someone who was directly affected by gun violence and mass shootings, it becomes very real. And you realize that nowhere in the US is safe. Schools aren't safe, movie theaters aren't safe, malls aren't safe, Grocery stores aren't safe, offices aren't safe, concerts aren't safe, yoga studios aren't safe. There was a shooting at a yoga studio in Florida. Restaurants aren't safe. I saw headlines for a shooting at a brunch restaurant on Easter Sunday. It's just incomprehensible that so many public places are at risk of gun violence here. And for a really long time, I just accepted that that was the way it is in the US. But when you go to other countries and you realize that people don't have to be afraid going to the grocery store or going to work or walking down the street, then you do think that there could be a better way here. This is another thing that I've talked to my relocation clients about on the phone, and it's just heartbreaking to hear from people who were teachers who quit their jobs because they didn't feel safe at schools, or parents that want to move when their kids get old enough to go to school because they don't want them to be at risk of shootings here. And it's not just elementary schools, it's also on college campuses, and it's really everywhere. And so I don't have the solution to this problem, and I don't want to make a political statement about it, but it's something that affects everyone's daily life in the US, and some people more than others. So this video is not to bash the United States, because no country is perfect. Everywhere has pros and cons, but these are just some of the main differences that I've discerned after spending a lot of time living in Europe and kind of going back between the US and Europe, and also traveling around the world. But there's a lot of talk about the American dream in the US, and I want to hope that the American dream isn't dead and people can still find freedom and find what they're looking for here. But I just wish for a better future for the US as well, where we don't have some of the problems and challenges that we are facing today. But that being said, whenever I'm feeling overwhelmed, and if you might be feeling that way too, the first thing I do is always just reflect on what I'm grateful for, and even being able to worry about these types of problems and not, how I'm going to put food on the table or how to put a roof over my head. So reflecting on, gratitude is a really good way to just ground yourself. Also meditating as well, and journaling. And then after that, you can take action, whether that means calling a friend or talking to a therapist or going out and volunteering and being active in the community. For some reason, talking to people and helping people is really good for our mental health and physical health and wellness as well. Another thing that helps is just narrowing down and focusing on what you can control. No single one of us can solve all of the problems in the world, but we can make different purchase decisions when it comes to takeout and fast food and things we're buying at retail stores. We can get involved in events and activities in our local community, and you can contribute to causes and organizations that you care about. Learning something new also helps. Take a class on Skillshare, learn something creative, improve a skill at work that can help you earn more of an income and have more financial freedom. Another fun thing to do is daydreaming and planning about your next trip abroad. And if you want some ideas on places that you can go, watch these videos next. And also, to prove that living abroad isn't perfect either, you can check out this video on some of the things that I don't like so much about living abroad.